So hello everybody, welcome to Dialogues. This is our second talk this semester and I would like to welcome Dr. Prayag Ray to this session. Thank you very much for joining us today. Professor Orko Chattopadhyay, my colleague, will introduce the speaker. I would also at the same time like to welcome the audience. Thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully more will join as the talk progresses. So I'll now, may I request you, Orko, to introduce the speaker and then get started. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Madhumita. So this is Orko here, and this is a great pleasure for me to introduce a very old friend of mine, Prayag. I would make it formal by saying Dr. Prayag Ray and Professor Ray, but he's also Prayag, and I've known him for a number of years now, so I would perhaps do a little bit of both. But just to maybe do the formal introduction first. Professor Prayag Ray is an assistant professor and head of the Department of English at Xavier University, Kolkata. He completed his BA and MA from Jadavpur University, his MPhil from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and his PhD from Queen's University, Belfast. His MPhil research was on Indian speculative fiction, while his PhD research was on British and Irish representations of Hinduism in the 18th century. His research interests include fantasy fiction, culture studies, religion and literature, and postcolonial literature. He has published critical work with Routledge and Springer, including a chapter in Critical Posthumanism and Planetary Futures from 2016, and has also published creative writing in Poetry Ireland Review. And in fact, I was remembering there were ages back, because I was remembering the creative writing course that we both did together as co-students. That was like many moons back, but in Jadavpur University, Rimidi, right? And with that as a sort of a slightly lingering look behind for fantasy, which might take us forward, so Professor Ray today will be talking about the politics of fantasy fiction. To give the precise title, the title of his talk is The Politics of Genre Fantasy, Role-Playing Games as a Case Study. And we're all really looking forward to this talk. Prayag, over to you. The floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Orkoda. So firstly, thank you so much, Orkoda and Madhumita Di, for inviting me to speak, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'll get started right away, I think, because time is short. So I do have a PPT, so I will share that for the first half of my talk. So do let me know when this becomes visible. Is this visible? Orkoda? Yeah, okay.
Yes, it is. Sorry, yeah.
So I'll just make this full screen. If you just give me a moment. Hold on. This is a bit tricky because, yes, from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so my talk today is on the politics of genre fantasy. So to begin with, let me just give you an overview of what I plan to talk about today. So there are three sections to this talk. In the first, I'll be talking about what fantasy is. So I'm pitching this to a non-specialist audience. I'm guessing there are students here who are not literature students. I want to clarify what fantasy is, which is by no means a simple task. I then want to talk about the politics of fantasy, by which I mean how these texts relate to power, how they relate to the late capitalist world that we live in, how does it configure race, gender, identity, and the likes. And I will then talk about, I'll give you an example of one way of approaching texts, which is a kind of old school left, what you might call a vulgar Marxist approach to reading texts. And I'll show you how role-playing games, fantasy role-playing games can be understood through that lens. Just a couple of kind of qualifying statements, caveats. The first is that, as I mentioned, I'm keeping this very, very simple for a general audience. And I am also a little bit wary because I'm going to be generalizing a little bit in this talk. And, we always tell our students to avoid generalizations, avoid sweeping statements, but nonetheless, I'm trying to give people some idea of the broader contours of the field. And I think it's useful to at least attempt to make some tentative heuristic generalizations in that direction. So I'll get started. Defining fantasy. Fantasy is everywhere. It thoroughly permeates the cultural sphere in the globalized 21st century and may, in the words of China Mieville, be called a kind of default cultural vernacular. But do we understand what it is? So there's a challenge in front of us, which is to try and define a very diverse body of literature, which has only a commitment to unreality as common ground. How do we go about doing this? To begin with, we can shorten our scope. Every story featuring the supernatural is not fantasy. Stories with a supernatural element are as old as storytelling itself, but modern fantasy fiction is a unique and relatively new phenomenon with distinct and describable characteristics, and it cannot be said to be more than about 150 years old. Modern Western fantasy fiction begins to emerge in roughly the mid-19th century, post-industrialization, in a world in which wonder is leached out by science and modernity, a world which therefore requires new invented mythologies in order to re-enchant it. Okay, so that is the origin of fantasy. Let's go ahead to try and clarify what exactly fantasy fiction is, because here a little bit of confusion arises with terminology. So you see, there is this broader term, speculative fiction or fantastic literature. And what I'll be talking about today, which is genre fantasy, is only one small subset of that, one small subgenre. So what is speculative fiction or fantastic literature? It's an umbrella term for any work that presents a world which is consistently marked by what we consider impossible in the real world at the present moment. These are works that are significantly marked by that which does not exist in reality, recorded history, nature, or the present universe. It is the literature of the supernatural or the futuristic or the imaginative, all right? Now, there are many subgenres here. You have, for instance, horror, in which the supernatural element aims to frighten us. You have science fiction, in which the impossible is not really impossible, it's plausible. There is some kind of a quasi-scientific framework that explains that which seems impossible or unlikely. There's magic realism, which is really very complicated. But essentially, it's a depiction of the real world with a kind of fantastic coloring, you might say. It's the ordinary made magical. It's a kind of a commentary on the complex nature of modernity, usually in post-colonial societies. I won't get into that. It's really quite complicated. There's superhero fiction, in which you have superhuman characters invested with magical powers often. You have dystopian fiction, which is not always fantastic, by the way. You can have, for instance, Handmaid's Tale, the little icon I've created here. It's really, there's nothing very improbable about it. It's just imagining a future in which fertility rates are dropping. But there is often a speculative or fantastic element in dystopian fiction. And there's nonsense, for instance, again, in which the supernatural or fantastic elements are usually satirical, are aimed to make us laugh and think, really. There's other categories as well, weird fiction, for instance, alternative history. So all of these are in some way speculative and fantastic. But what I'm going to be talking about today is genre fantasy. Is a genre which is marked by magic. This is the literature in which supernatural elements are sort of expressed through magic. Okay. And what I will be trying to clarify now is what exactly is it that makes this subgenre distinct from the rest? What is it about genre fantasy that makes it distinct? So that's what we can move on to discuss. And here, there are many definitions one could look at, but I like to look at a definition given to us by Colin Manlove in a book called Modern Fantasy. And he says that fantasy is a fiction evoking wonder and containing a substantial and irreducible element of the supernatural. with which the mortal characters in the story or the readers become on at least partly familiar terms. So let's try to unpack this a little bit. First and foremost, it must be a work of fiction. The author should not be trying to convince us that the impossible things described really happened. Thus, a medieval book about witches, while being about what we consider supernatural, is not fantasy fiction because the author is making a claim that witches really exist, presumably, right? So fantasy must have verisimilitude. That is, it must seem like reality, but it must not claim verity. That is, it must not claim to actually be factual, all right? Moving on, we can look at the word wonder. So by wonder is meant anything from astonishment at the marvelous to a sense of meaning in the mysterious, or even of the numinous, okay? Wonder is generated by the presence of the supernatural or the impossible, and from the element of mystery and lack of explanation that goes with it, okay? So it's a literature that makes us feel awe and wonder. So I'm sure many of you would have read at least Harry Potter or have watched the films. And, you know, as soon as we enter Diagon Alley, we are struck by how wonderful and enchanting and novel and strange this invented world is. Thirdly, the supernatural. It must contain a substantial element of the impossible, that which is beyond any remotely conceivable extension of our plane of reality or thought. There must be no plausible or rational explanation given for the fantastic elements present in the story. If we did have a rational explanation, we are entering the zone of science fiction, okay? So an unexplained element of the impossible, which also has to be substantial. This means that the sheer amount of the supernatural should be, there should be a substantial amount of it, really. So, for instance, Virginia Woolf's Orlando, this is a book in which there is a kind of supernatural device, but that's really inessential to the message of the story. It's really a kind of enacting a kind of cultural history. And that's the book's real concern. And the fantastic device is a mere machine. So it's not a substantial element of the story, which is why we don't usually call Orlando a work of fantasy. Okay. The supernatural, by the way, in fantasy is usually manifested as magic. So it's the literature of magic, the literature in which the world is permeated by magic, and in which magic is what Michael McClintock calls the principle of control. That is, it's the power that's used by characters to exercise agency in this world, okay? So in science fiction, agency is exercised through technology, and in fantasy, it's magic that does the same. Furthermore, this supernatural element must be irreducible. That means it should not be possible to wholly explain away the supernatural, neither through a rational means nor through some other mechanism. For instance, it should not be a mere hallucination, and it shouldn't be ideally a moral fable or a direct allegory, because all of these will detract from one's experience of this other world and bring you back to the primary reality in which you live. If there is a direct point-for-point allegory, if you're reading the fantasy and you can see this is clearly simply a thinly veiled representation of real historical events, again, that takes away from it being a fantasy, because you're taken away from that as, you know, secondary world and reduced back to the primary world, which is again a reason why we don't usually want to think of obviously satirical works as fantasy. Gulliver's Travels, for instance, you're aware that this is a satire. So that really takes away from its being a fantasy in that sense, okay? Similarly, magic realism is something that is different from genre fantasy, because in magic realism, the fantasy is a kind of thinly veiled commentary on an actual reality. It doesn't have the same function as the supernatural in genre fantasy, okay? Sorry, just turning my air conditioner on there. Finally, and fourthly, the supernatural must become familiar in fantasy, okay? So the reader becomes intimately familiar with the marvelous because of the detailed way in which the author renders the marvelous. This is what distinguishes fantasy, for instance, from horror. In horror, the supernatural is usually left alien, a kind of point of frisson, a kind of point of shock. Whereas in fantasy, the supernatural is intimately explored through world building. Okay, so that is a little uh, definition, which I think is a pretty good one for what fantasy fiction is. A few examples, incidentally, all of us, I think, would be familiar with these authors: J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea series, Harry Potter, of course, J.K. Rowling, Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, and George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones. Incidentally, many of these have been adapted recently. You can see in TV and film. That element of the wonderful, really the enchanting, the magical really comes across quite well, I think, in visual media. Okay, so now we approach the politics of fantasy fiction, and I want to introduce you to some genre cliches. Fantasy fiction has been dominated by certain authors for the last 30, 40, 50 years, most importantly Tolkien. And the sheer influence of these authors has created a kind of template, which later authors go on to imitate. So what are some of the cliches of fantasy fiction? Well, we can see that the sources for this body of writing is usually European mythology, folk tales, fairy tales, the medieval romance. We find that it is often set in a feudal or medieval setting and hence is backward looking. It tends to be a romantic literature in that it foregrounds the natural as a kind of antidote to modernity. It is critical of, it is afraid of the technological and the modern, really, the industrial particularly. So it tends to be anti-modern. Again, what kind of governments do we find depicted? Usually monarchical governments. We often find, though not always, a polarized moral economy in that good and evil are binaries. We often encounter stock figures and stock tropes, including the Senex, wise old man figure, Gandalf or Dumbledore or Yoda. A hidden monarch who is a kind of the hero, basically, who begins off in a kind of rustic setting and is just your average Joe until he finds out that he is of some noble lineage and is fated to become the monarch. There are often dark lords, dragons. There is a bestiary, a kind of imaginary stock of characters, of animals that fantastic animals that fantasy leans on. Magical objects, invented languages, prophecies, curses, wizards, witches, fellowships. So most of us would be familiar with these stock figures. There is also a kind of stock narrative pattern, typical narrative pattern, which Joseph Campbell would call in his Hero with a Thousand Faces, the hero's journey. It is a kind of journey from the known into the unknown, involving a kind of climactic showdown with an embodiment of evil or entropy and a kind of return to the home space, there and back again pattern. And it's a journey that also has, as I'll soon unpack, certain colonial undertones. One must mention that fantasy is ineluctably influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien's work, which becomes a kind of template for others. It often configures race as essence. That is to say that race not only implies physical differences, but moral worth is also indexed by race. Tends to be male-centric as well. Note that these cliches are changing, and we'll talk about that soon. Okay, now, what are the politics of fantasy fiction? Here, I must begin by clarifying what do we mean by the word politics in the humanities? Because we don't usually mean it in the most narrow kind of governmental sense. When most people say politics, they mean BJP, Congress. We don't usually use it in this strictly limited sense, though sometimes we do. Politics as we use it in the humanities, as I see it, really implies how do these texts relate to power? How are they reflections of relations of economic, social, and cultural power? Are these texts ideological? That is to say, are they marked by the deeply entrenched values and beliefs of the dominant classes? Are they informed by the modes of feeling, valuing, perceiving, and believing, which maintain and reproduce social power and reinforce established traditions? Are they marked by certain kinds of valuation, certain kinds of exclusion, certain kinds of marginalization? Are they mythological in the Barthesian sense, in what Roland Barthes would call mythological? That is to say, do they transform historically contingent and socially constructed views into a kind of timeless or universal truth? How do they configure race, ethnicity, gender, and identity? How do they interpolate and address its readers as subjects? How do they influence the reader's sense of identity? So these are the questions that I imply when I talk about the politics of fantasy. Now, I must here say that these are very broad questions applied to a very diverse genre. So one must start by noting a methodological problem, which is to say that one cannot simply foist a generalization unproblematically across the entire body of fantasy literature. Some authors, some texts are more conservative, others are more radical. We see an entire spectrum of views, really. But one can, I think, tentatively chalk out what you might call battle lines between older fantasy, which tends to be Eurocentric and male-centric, and newer fantasy writing, which is challenging this model. So the older body of writing you might label as Tolkienesque fantasy, which is fantasy written following on from J.R.R. Tolkien, imitating the Tolkienesque model. You might call this high fantasy or sword and sorcery fantasy. What can one say about this kind of writing? Well, it's dominated by dead white authors. It is marked by a nostalgia for a bygone European past, nostalgia for monarchy. When you see peasants in these stories, they tend to be idealized in much the same way that, for instance, W.B. Yeats would idealize the peasantry of Ireland. When you see heroes, you will see them usually saving a traditional order from foreigners, from others. Okay, there's a kind of xenophobia in the genre. You see, the other represented as orcs and trolls and differently colored, coming from the east often. Okay, race is essence, as I've already mentioned, different not only in terms of skin, color, or height, but in terms of moral worth, refinement, wisdom, and political integrity. Limited roles for women often, either few female characters or women cast in traditional roles, nurturing mothers or damsels in distress. Absolute morality, again, good and evil binary. Okay. Here I want to just quote briefly from China Miéville. He's a well-known socialist fantasy writer who says that in these kinds of fantasy novels, if there's a problem with the ruler of the kingdom, it's because he's a bad king as opposed to a king. So the problem is not monarchy itself, but the kind of monarch. If peasants are visible, they're likely to be good, simple folk rather than downtrodden wretches. So, if the peasants were represented as downtrodden wretches, that might be critical of the system that produces these peasants to begin with, but, it's not. Strong men protect curvaceous women. Superheroic protagonists stamp their will on history, like characters in Nietzschean wet dreams. But at the same time, things are determined by fate rather than social agency. Social threats are pathological, invading from outside rather than born from within. Morality is absolute, with characters and often whole races lining up to fall into pigeonholes with good and evil written on them. So if this is a model of fantasy offered by the likes of Lewis and Tolkien, we do see things changing in recent decades. Here, I'll just very briefly mention a few authors. Philip Pullman, who has a series called His Dark Materials. Pullman is an anarchist writer who very strongly criticizes organized religion. in his Dark Materials. Ursula Le Guin, who is a left anarchist, often questioning simplistic notions of good and evil, as well as gender. Her Left Hand of Darkness, of course, is a very famous science fiction novel. You have China Miéville here, the bald gentleman here, who is a socialist writer reclaiming fantasy for the working class, and a number of non-white authors doing very interesting work. I might want to mention here, for instance, Octavia Butler, who is bottom right in this slide, as well as N.K. Jemisin. Okay, so these are just a few authors. Octavia Butler is writing fantasy that is extremely critical of hierarchies of every kind, racism, sexism, ethnocentrism. Her fantasies are replaying the domination of the weak by the strong as a kind of parasitism. Butler's others, whether aliens or vampires, are defied by protagonists who embody difference and diversity. Okay, so that's Butler. N.K. Jemisin, for instance, is committed to writing politically radical fantasy. She says, and I quote, "I just want to write about things blowing up, gods and planets and moons crashing into things. What I write ends up being very political. If I write about dragons, I'm writing about dragons as a black woman, and it's fucking political." Please excuse the expletives there. So that is fantasy literature. Now, very quickly, because I don't want to take up too much time on this section, I want to tell you a little bit about fantasy criticism as well, and political divides in fantasy criticism. So I map it out here, and I would like to suggest that there are three camps of criticism in fantasy criticism. And these are mainly the conservative camp, which is the camp we'll start with. The conservative camp, which is, these views are espoused by the likes of George MacDonald, J.R.R. Tolkien himself, C.S. Lewis, and Anne Swinfen. These authors see fantasy as an antidote to the degraded modern world, an ideal literature, capturing lost beauty of bygone eras. They argue that fantasy should be consistent and marked by harmonious internal laws, as well as a kind of moral lawfulness, that is to say, good and evil, and evil punished by good. And finally, you might say that their understanding of fantasy is also a distinctly Christian understanding of fantasy. Echoing Christ's revelation that there is more to existence than the banal world of factories and cities that we inhabit, a beautiful paradisial other world. So that's the kind of conservative, you might say, humanist conservative camp. Then there's the old left, which is influenced by the Frankfurt School, by the likes of Adorno and Horkheimer, who are very dismissive of fantasy. They see fantasy as a literature of escape, a form of bourgeois false consciousness, a literature that detracts attention from real political struggles, a kind of opium for the masses, something to delude people from the obvious fact of oppression that marks their reality. It therefore tends to perpetuate the political status quo rather than challenge it. And they see fantasy as preventing its audience from using reason for social critique. There is also the new left, which is actually trying to reclaim fantasy, which is saying that the old left is somewhat myopic in its view of fantasy, perhaps focusing only on certain authors. But if you broaden your understanding of what fantasy is, they claim that one can redeem it. How so? They claim that fantasy is innately subversive. They claim that the fantastic signifier is a site of slippage and deferral. So this school really is, informed by both psychoanalysis as well as post-structuralism. Critics in this camp, by the way, include the likes of Rosemary Jackson and others, including China Miéville. So the fantastic signify as a site of slippage and deferral, the fantastic as open to contradictory interpretations, the fantastic as a site where reality is broken and rearranged and thoroughly questioned, fantasy as a kind of literature of desire. Here, really, we go into a kind of psychoanalytical view of fantasy, which I must admit I'm not well versed in, so I won't get very much further with that. But a literature expressing our often repressed desires, and also a literature that expresses the debilitating effects of living in a materialist culture. And finally, this hasn't appeared as a separate bullet point, but the last point I might articulate here is that it is seen as a kind of neurotic counterpoint to capitalism's rationality. Let me just explain and expand on that point a little bit. Jose Monleon, who writes a book called A Socio-Historical Approach to the Fantastic, argues that scientific thought and systemic rationality on which capitalism lays a claim tends to repress things that recur in fantasy as unreason. Okay, so capitalism lays claim to a certain rationality, to a scientific mindset, and that rationality suppresses certain things which bubble up in fantasy, which is a kind of unreason, the literature of unreason. Okay, so we can see, and here Monleon says that the specter of revolution seems to be at the base of this reappearance of unreason. The unreason of fantasy is a kind of neurotic counterpoint to capitalism's irrationality. Capitalism's rationality. Okay. So capitalism's reason produces its own monsters. Right. So that is a very quick overview of fantasy criticism and its politics. So I'm just going to stop my slide share here because I want to move on to the second half of my talk, where I talk about fantasy video games. So just to kind of recap, we've looked at what fantasy is, how it's different from speculative fiction broadly, what the genre implies, some of the politics of the center of the genre represented by Tolkienesque fantasy, and we've also looked at some challenging new writing that's emerging. And finally, I've given you a quick overview of fantasy criticism. Okay, now I want to move on to talk about fantasy role-playing games. And here I will be drawing on some recent work of mine. Actually, there's a bit of a backstory to this. Many years ago, I had a stint of really escaping from reality. When I was a college student, I think we all did to some extent, but Jadavpur যখন ছিলাম আমি মন দিয়ে, I didn't study very much. Well, I did, but I read, but I wasn't, kind of an ideal student in that sense. And there was a phase where I kind of dropped out of reality and I lost myself in games. I lost myself in most notably MMORPGs, which are the type of game that I'll be telling you about. And I realized while I experienced that for 2 or 3 months, I was so addicted to this kind of gaming that I literally did nothing else. I didn't go to college for 2 or 3 months. I just played this game. I would barely do anything else. I would eat, I would sleep, and I would game. And never before, I am a gamer, but never before in my life have I experienced anything quite as addictive. And I realized that this addictiveness can be brought down to one single factor, which is the way in which these MMORPGs get us hooked to consumption, to consuming in a certain pattern, to fetishizing commodities. And that's what I want to talk about in the second half of my paper. Okay, so I am drawing on some recent work which appeared in a Springer volume, a chapter on commodity fetishism in MMORPGs. So let me begin by telling you what MMORPGs are. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games are a type of video game in which there is a persistent virtual world. It is online, and players of the game play as a kind of character, an avatar, which is customizable. And you you move this character around in this 3D virtual world. And the purpose of the game, the idea behind the game is character development. There is no end to the game. It's an open world without, there are elements of story, but there's no ending. You can just keep on leveling up. The idea is to gain experience and level up. So you improve, you become stronger, faster, sharper. You can kill monsters more easily. You get better and better weapons and the like. Okay, and most importantly, there are real human beings. The other players are not just kind of computer generated, they are other human beings. And you can interact with them much as you would with a real human being. Okay, you can talk to them, you can even sing and dance. There are virtual instruments, believe it or not. You can go to virtual bars and have virtual drinks. So it's really quite fascinating. And there is also a kind of virtual economy, which is what is at the heart of today's paper. So let me move on quickly to tell you what I'm going to talk about over the next maybe 15 minutes at the most. Essentially, I will argue that MMORPGs replicate and thereby help to perpetuate patterns of consumption within late capitalism. And they do so by immersing gamers in an ethos of virtual consumerism, predicated upon a fetishizing of the virtual object. Okay, so we become obsessed with objects in these games, and this kind of perpetuates patterns of consumption within late capitalism. And there is a great deal of impact that this has, because the deep investment of players in their avatars, which is quite well established in the kind of scientific literature on MMOs, leads to a blurring of boundaries between the virtual and the real, and it creates the potential for the transference of behaviors from the virtual to the real. So essentially, these games are training you in certain patterns of consumption. And because you're so deeply invested in it, because it trains your mind in a particular way, when you leave that world, you may want to carry on these patterns of behavior, okay? In the final section of my paper, I'll also talk about fantasy's role. I'll be specifically focusing on fantasy MMORPGs and how they contribute to this ethos of virtual consumerism. Okay, so I want to quickly move into the first section where I talk about commodity fetishism, and here I am using a specifically Marxist concept. Okay, so what I'm trying to do here actually is to illustrate one way of reading fantasy texts, which is the old left methodology, basically. Okay, so Karl Marx, in the first few chapters of Das Kapital, will articulate an idea called commodity fetishism, which is later developed by the likes of Lukács and Baudrillard. And here he essentially talks about the investing of human or superhuman agency in non-human things. Okay, now Marx theorizes this through productive activities, and later thinkers theorize it through consumption. The theory here is a little bit complicated. I'm not going to go into details, but I'll tell you very briefly. I'll give you a kind of brief overview. So to begin with, the fetishism of commodities that arises through productive activities, Marx talks about how in the process of producing commodities, laborers become objects. That is, a subject becomes an object, and objects seem to gain a kind of subjectivity. Okay, there's a opposite movement. The subject, the laborer, produces himself or herself as an object because they become mere factors in production. Okay, there is what Marx calls alienation. You are not deeply involved in what you're making because of division of labor. You're only, think about Dexter's lab. Dexter's turning one screw. But at the end, there'll be a TV produced, which seems to have almost magical powers. How did this TV come about? I'm just turning a screw, right? So that is alienation in a sense. And so the subject becomes a kind of object, a factor of production. And the product, the good that is produced, the commodity, on the other hand, seems to gain a kind of subjectivity because it seems to have a life and agency of its own. It has a kind of autonomy in the marketplace. The marketplace seems to operate without human interference almost. And it enters into relationships with other goods. Not only that, it seems to have properties that are incommensurate to the labor that you put into it. Okay, so the object gains a kind of almost human agency. Okay, that's what Marx says. And I want to suggest that in fantasy MMORPGs, the same thing happens because of a process that is called crafting. Crafting is a way of producing virtual commodities in these games. You can, as a user, create commodities. And in the process of creating this commodity, much like the factory laborer, you become a kind of factor of production. You are only playing a small role in making the finished product. You're reliant on other people's labor. So there's a division of labor. So you become a kind of factor of production. There are marketplaces in these games as well, in which, again, commodities are sort of entering into relationships with each other that seem to be autonomous and unaffected by individual choices. And finally, in fantasy MMORPGs, the objects that are produced have literally magical powers within the world. So the object has a kind of aura, a kind of agency, okay? So that is fetishism of commodities arising through production in MMORPGs. But let's also talk about consumption. And this is the real kind of meat of my paper. So Lukáš, Thorstein Veblen, Jean Baudrillard, and others would theorize about how within capitalism, a kind of fetishism of the commodity arises through consumption. First and foremost, the commodity dominates all aspects of human life within capitalism. There is a tendency, secondly, towards conspicuous consumption, which is really defying the law of demand and buying goods for exorbitant prices for their status, for their status. And the likes of Baudrillard and Veblen and Lukáš have also talked about how advertising and publicity images contribute to a kind of mystique which attaches itself to objects, to commodities, okay? So through our habits of consumption in capitalism, we are fetishizing objects. Now, all of these, I argue, are reflected in fantasy MMORPGs, because at the heart of these games, the driving force of these games is the ostentatious use of commodities. I had this realization while playing these games because all that I was doing and what other people seem to be obsessed with doing is simply gathering more materials, building better items, trying to get more and more extravagant and powerful commodities, basically, okay? Now, fantasy is a genre of wish fulfillment. And in these fantasy MMORPGs, a particular kind of wish seems to be magically fulfilled, which is the wish for extravagant commodities, for exorbitant wealth and limitless power. In these games, anyone can become fabulously wealthy, first and foremost, promoting a kind of capitalist myth that you can, through your activities, become fabulously wealthy, the idea of the rags to riches story, because all you require is to play the game for a long time and you will become wealthy. So anyone can become fabulously wealthy, anyone can dress extravagantly, your sartorial markers of class, you can dress extravagantly, and you can also become immensely powerful, okay? So all of these, I argue in my paper, are deeply ideological. They are, they promote the myths on which capitalism rests, okay? The medieval setting of these games, particularly the likes of Lord of the Rings Online, which is the most famous MMORPG, the most widely played one, and World of Warcraft, the medieval setting contributes to this ostentatious use of commodities. Why? Because as we know, in the medieval and early modern period, power was consolidated through the bodily display of finery, okay? You know about royal progresses. The king and queen would process through the streets bedecked in finery. So there is that kind of an atmosphere in these games as well, where a level 60 champion in the Lord of the Rings Online, for instance, will be clearly distinguished by a very prestigious kind of clothing. His rank and class will be clearly indexed by sartorial markers, okay? This is very different from the world we live in. I mean, look at Bill Gates, look at Mark Zuckerberg. They often dress like, hobos, okay? But this is a medieval world where people are, you're expected to wear that kind of clothing. So consumerism, therefore, is expressed through conspicuous consumption in these games. So we come to certain conclusions then, when we look at these games closely. Firstly, that MMORPG gameplay constantly involves mercantile activities. Traders and markets are ubiquitous. Even if there's some kind of apocalyptic event at the end of the game, there's a joke that some shopkeeper in the game will always survive. There will be an NPC, a non-playable character, shopkeeper selling the most expensive goods at the climactic, in the endings. Well, there aren't endings in MMORPGs, but in RPGs there are. Anyway, you find in these games, secondly, that consumerist desire is constantly stoked by the existence of increasingly more powerful and valuable items. There's always something better to buy, okay? And we can outline a kind of acquisitive drive in these games, which I want to just quickly share my screen and show you. I have a kind of diagram that explains it. Let me know if this is visible. Is this visible?
Yes.
So I explain it quite simply as follows. You go on small quests, and this involves killing enemies and gathering resources, okay? Raw materials, literally, you're collecting wood, you're collecting gold, you're collecting ore. These, the money and the raw materials that you then collect is used in three ways. You can go to auction houses where you can sell these and buy products, and actual auctions happen. There are crafters, which is characters that build items for you if you give them money and raw materials. And finally, there are NPC vendors, that is non-playable character, the computer-generated characters who also sell items, and you can spend your money and raw materials there. What happens then is that you get better items and you become stronger. The player gets these better items and continues to go on more advanced quests where they get more money and more raw materials, and so the cycle continues, okay? So that's the kind of acquisitive drive that defines fantasy MMORPGs. Okay, there are a few more things one might say, and I'm quickly wrap up here. I'm nearly done. Aside from promoting commodity fetishism through production and consumption, MMORPGs also promote other facets of the capitalist worldview, Weltanschauung. For instance, Chris Deed has argued that they encourage entrepreneurial risk-taking. Because after all, you're playing with an avatar in a virtual world. Whatever risks you take, you're not going to end up in debtor's prison, right? You're in a virtual world. So it seems to promote the risk-taking that is fundamental to the capitalist mode of production. Next, we might mention that these games also promote the myth of social advancement in a free and open society. Why? Because you start off as a kind of low-ranking member of the rank and file, but anyone can become extremely powerful by playing the game for a long time, right? So you can basically climb the ladder to success and status, which promotes that rags to riches myth, okay? And this could tie in with what you might call the American dream, right? The dream of the self-made person. So that's basically it. That's the main thing I had to say. Incidentally, a couple of last points I'll make that, since we're talking about these virtual economies, one interesting thing that happens in these games over and over is inflation. Why does inflation happen? Because, well, you can keep earning more and more money, right? More and more virtual money by completing quests, but the number of goods that you can buy are limited. So more money, right? More money and less goods. So the value of money falls. You understand how inflation works. If you have more of a currency, if you print more currency, its value falls. So there's inflation. Now, how is this inflation managed? It's very interesting. It's managed in such a way that even, that further promotes consumerism. How? First and foremost, people will often have to resort to barter. When money becomes absolutely valueless, they will have to trade in commodities themselves, right? So this means that commodities, these objects, virtual objects, gain even more prestige and importance. This leads to a kind of, it furthers the fetishizing of these objects, right? The second way to manage inflation is through what is called cash drains. Cash drains, what do? You create, the makers of these games create expansion packs. That is, they create more territory, a kind of terra nullius, which you can then go on to sort of colonize, okay? More monsters to kill, more environments to loot and pillage, which is again supporting that capitalist colonialist drive to consume. And finally, they create these limited stock items, prestige items. And they bombard you, your email. I used to have my email linked to it. All day long, I would get, oh, offer, sale, cholche, limited stock spring horse. Buy this spring horse. It has really great armor and speed, etc. So this is what they do. They create these prestige items, okay? So that's basically it. I just wanted to mention a couple of last things and then I'm wrap up, which is that the fantasy setting exacerbates these tendencies, okay? Fantasy has its roots in Romance literature and the quest structure, right? So that quest structure, you're going out there to forage and to explore and to slay and, to gather more materials. The quest adds to that, okay? And secondly, fantasy arguably is a kind of, genre of mystification, which prevents its audience from critiquing social reality and the like, which we've already gone over. So really the fantasy setting of many of these games adds to these problems, okay? Now, what are the implications of all of this? We know because of extensive scientific work that's been done that MMORPGs lead to a great deal of investment and emotional proximity between the gamers and their avatars, right? So you attach yourself very deeply to these games. And we also know because of the work of Dickey, Spain and Vega, Silcox and others that it fosters learning. MMORPGs really train our minds in particular ways. So what then happens? You're deeply invested in these games. You're emotionally connected to these games. There's even a case of someone committing suicide, believe it or not, a young American boy called Sean Woolley. His virtual goods were stolen and he was so depressed by this that he killed himself because his goods were stolen in a video game. So anyway, so that is how addicted people get. And these patterns of consumption which you get addicted to can therefore transfer out into the real world because of how they foster learning, okay? That's it. The last thing I'll talk about is a phenomenon called gold farming. Very disturbingly, what happens in some parts of the world, in China, Indonesia, is that people have found out a way to misuse these games. You have basically capitalists who create sweatshops where you have underpaid laborers playing these games and earning virtual money, accruing virtual goods and money, which is then sold for real money. So gamers can go to PayPal, can go to various websites, not PayPal, eBay and other websites and buy the virtual money for real money. And so underpaid laborers basically spend all day playing these games. And you also have this illusion of free to play. Free to play means you can buy the game for free. But if you want to progress beyond a certain level, you have to pay real money. Okay, so these games are also tied to an actual capitalism, actual practices within capitalism, including gold farming, which is the first practice, and this way of monetizing the entire system. Okay, so that's pretty much all I have to say. I'll just sum up by saying that the central point that I was trying to establish in the second half of this paper is that fantasy MMORPGs, through the fetishization of virtual commodities, both through productive and consumptive activities, promote the values of consumerism, the deep emotive investment of players and the addictive potential of these games make them ideal spaces for indoctrination. Okay, and these patterns can then transfer into the real world and further support the capitalist status quo. Okay, so that's pretty much what I have to say. Thank you very much. Open it up for questions.